Good morning, everyone. My name is Ellen Ray, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stillwater Foundation and Board President of Texas Rural Funders. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to our first ever Broadband Summit. Yay! It is truly exciting to see so many people from across the state gathered today in person to discuss broadband and, most importantly, how we can take advantage of the opportunities before us. Before we talk about the future, I want to share just a bit about where we've been. Texas Rural Funders, or TRF, is a coalition of philanthropic organizations partnering to bring attention and resources to rural Texas. TRF began working on digital connectivity in 2018 because our members understood that without access to the internet, there's no 21st century education, healthcare, workforce development, commerce, tourism. I don't have to tell you all, the list goes on and on. We could have never imagined that just a few years later, a pandemic would shine a direct spotlight on the long-standing digital divide in both rural and urban communities. In response, Texas Rural Funders partnered with Texas 2036 and the Greater Houston Partnership to form the Digital Texas Coalition ahead of the 2021 legislative session. Together, we work to inform folks about our state's connectivity needs. Thanks to the efforts of so many community partners, many of whom are in the room today, and legislative champions, House Bill 5 was successfully passed last year with full bipartisan support. This is a tremendous step forward for the state of Texas, but as we all know, this means the work has only just begun. The goal of this Broadband Summit is to provide insights and tools you can use to advance connectivity in your home community and to network with others engaged in broadband work at all levels. We'll hear from national and state thought leaders that have deep expertise in broadband, and we'll also highlight the great work taking place right here in Texas communities so we can learn from each other. There are three key ideas that you'll hear throughout our program today, and we hope that you'll take them with you. So everybody get out your pencil. Number one, plan regionally. Over the last 2 years, because of the challenges of the pandemic, so many of us have been focused on making sure that our individual communities are connected, and rightly so. But if we want to build a solid foundation for future generations to have every opportunity the internet can provide, we have to partner across county lines. Today, we encourage you to consider how your community can collaborate regionally to leverage resources and create economies of scale. Number two takeaway, pursue public-private partnerships. Tackling digital access, adoption, and use is a big undertaking that no single organization can tackle alone. Today, you'll hear several examples of effective public-private partnerships. These didn't just fall into place. They were built with intention and strategy to leverage each partner's strengths. They encountered bumps in the road, but they worked through them because the whole is truly greater than the sum of its parts. And finally, number three is simple. Start now. As the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. It's the same with digital connectivity. We're rural funders. We love the land. We can always make a link between a tree and the internet. So if your community hasn't begun planning, we hope that today serves as a catalyst to get started. With broadband funding becoming available over the next 6 to 8 months, it's very important that you've done the foundational work of gathering your team, understanding your needs, and developing a plan. Even though some Texas communities are farther ahead than others, we're all figuring this out together, and we can learn from one another. Not to mention, with unprecedented state and federal funding becoming available, there's no time to waste. So in the spirit of starting now, let's learn a bit more about who's in the room today. I'll ask that you please stand if you identify with these descriptions, and then you can sit down after you've stood up for the next group. So if you're from a community that's just getting started working on broadband, and let me assure you, you're in the right place, please stand up. Great, welcome. Next group, if you're a community that's been working on broadband for a while, go ahead and stand up. Super. If you are a broadband provider, awesome, great. If you offer broadband equipment or technology solutions, please stand up. If you hold a legislative office or serve in an advocacy role, please stand up. Just halfway stand up. Next, if you're a broadband consultant, super. Next, if you represent a state agency, I'm looking at you, Greg. And finally, if you represent a nonprofit organization, please stand up. Terrific, thank you. Hopefully you spotted one or two people you'd like to follow up with today. And in addition to all the expertise we clearly have right here in the room, we have a new broadband guide published by Texas Rural Funders on your tables. Get connected, y'all, a guide for Texas communities on securing broadband. This guide will also be sent out via email following today's summit, and we'll be adding you to TRF's newsletter so you can stay up to date on broadband news and funding opportunities. So please keep an eye out for that in your inbox. Now it is my pleasure to introduce someone who knows a great deal about resources, Texas Comptroller Glenn Hagar. Comptroller Hagar has a long history of public service, holding positions in the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. Before becoming elected, the 36th Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts in 2014. Since then, Mr. Hagar has served as treasurer, check writer, tax collector, procurement officer, and revenue estimator for the state of Texas, the world's 9th largest economy. As if that weren't enough to keep him busy, the new Broadband Development Office is now under the Comptroller's charge as well. I can't think of a better leader to kick off our program today. Please join me in welcoming Comptroller Hagar.
Thank you, Ellen. I appreciate that. Number one, I wish in the bio you could have left off the fact that I'm the tax collector. As I was, true story, every time I either mention that and or someone says it in my bio, before that, I'm always looking for an exit, and it reminds me why I look for the exit, because when people find out you're the tax collector, you're like, I got to get out the door real fast. And part of that is this morning, I drove through a small town. I grew up not far from here, Highway 290 going towards Houston. There's a small town before you get to Hockley, which is where I grew up, a community called Waller, which is where I went to school at. My grandfather on my mom's side was a Baptist preacher, and I remember Lowell Thompson's sermons when I was a very young child about how they stoned the tax collector in the Bible. So you wonder why I look for the exit? It's for that very reason. Also, I have to say thank you, Ellen, for getting everybody to stand up, because as I was looking around the room, having everybody stand up, I felt like Greg and I were back on our 12-city tour. There's a lot of familiar faces in this room, so let me just say from the very beginning, I want to say thank you for each and every one of you that came out to the tour, who has participated in that process with us. We have found it extremely helpful, extremely important, and so I want to highlight and emphasize that part on the very beginning, so thank you for participating in that process. It's great to be here. It's great to be with a lot of like-minded people who know that rural communities are extremely important to the state of Texas. And, I think your group says it so perfectly. Texas will succeed only if rural Texas succeeds. And I agree with that in large part because so much of our residents that live in the rural communities too often feel like they're not part of some of the other parts of the state of Texas. And broadband gives us that ability to bring everybody back together as Texans. You know, my background is not unfamiliar than so many of you. As I mentioned, I grew up in a rural community. I still call rural roots as my roots, growing up on a family farming operation, watching my grandfather when I was a young child seal deals with other people with literally just a handshake. His handshake was his word and his bond. But I quickly realized that not everybody believes a handshake is a word and a bond, so I became a lawyer as a result because words matter on paper. But you know, let's talk kind of real quick. I've been around the process, as Ellen mentioned, either in the legislative process, House, Senate, executive branch. For when you said that, I thought, yeah, for a very long time. I feel like for a very long time. And in that long time, like you, we have talked about internet connectivity over and over and over and over again. And part of that has been about economic development for rural communities. But the pandemic taught us, highlighted, not just for those in this room, but literally across the entire state of Texas, that without that internet connectivity, not a whole lot can exist. And so whether that is the fact that we need connectivity for rural economic development, or more so now for telemedicine, for public education, for healthcare, that connectivity is as vital as ever before. You know, whether I am sitting in my office in Austin looking over some of the latest financial reports, or whether I am in my mobile office, which reminds me years ago, back when Raphael and I served in the House, I remember one of my constituents called me and she said, "Glenn, are you in your office?" And I said, "Actually, I am." And she said, "Great. Are you in Austin or the one in Katy?" And I said, "Well, no, actually, I'm in my mobile office." And she said, "I'm sorry, where is that?" "Oh, that's at the farm." And I said, "Well, not really." He said, "Oh, you're in the car." And I said, "Well, not really." She goes, "Okay, where are you?" And I said, "Actually, I'm driving a tractor right now. We're planting corn and I'm bedding rows." And so anyway, long story short, her son was down from tech. He needed to do an interview with somebody who was in elected office. Yes, have him come out. So later that afternoon, late, she called me and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know, David really was amazed at the technology that y'all use. It is just absolutely amazing to him, the prescription application and the GPS systems and da-da-da-da-da." And she went on and on and on and on. And then she finally said, "Oh, and by the way, he thought you were interesting too." I say that in part to highlight the fact that that was many years ago, and today technology is even more important in every single one of our lives, regardless of where we live. As we all know in this room, we have 3 million households, 7 million people across the state of Texas. I cite those numbers quite frequently to individuals as I'm talking about internet access, and it's amazing how many people go, "Wait, 7 million? That's a quarter of the entire state's population." And I highlight the point. It's amazing how that fact for so many don't quite understand that connectivity that is lacking for so many. So in part, that's the reason, as we all know, and thank you again, as Ellen mentioned in her introduction and talking to everybody, thank you for everybody in this room that helped Texas finally get over the hill, just the first hill, which is the easy task of creating the Broadband Development Office, because Texas, as you know, was one of just a few states that didn't even have an office. So yes, we are behind in the fact that we don't have a plan, but Greg, his team, my team are working very hard to make sure that we have that plan in place by the middle of June. And then with that plan, we are going to utilize to how we issue grants, how we go through the process for other financial incentives to try to help make connectivity across greater parts of the state. In early October, we hope to be able to start allowing money to get out the door. I want to highlight one point as we were on a call yesterday. The Federal American Rescue Plan, as we all know, allocates $500 million as the legislature appropriated to my office. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act makes sure that every state has $100 million, yet we're still waiting, as we all know, as in what is the final amount that each state is going to get, including Texas. We all know that there's a 25% local match. I don't know, many in this room, many others are wanting to go to the representative and others, telling them a number that we need to have. Well, I'm asking you, encouraging you to tell them we need a number, but don't give a number, because we're still trying to figure out what that number is. So just hold on. We got to really get our plan in place. We got to get our maps in place to then be able to really understand what is the number if we are truly going to help close the gap to, in addition to federal money, whether it's a 25% match or whether also it's above that, because we've talked about this a significant amount, and it's, in my opinion, I think the state needs to have a significant amount invested in this as the state of Texas, because I think it's our responsibility to make that match rather than putting that burden on the locals, because you're doing a lot of other work already. Now, my office will work with the federal guidance of which has been given. So here recently, as you know, the notice of funding opportunity was issued for the infrastructure plan, the bill that was passed. Yet, as we've been talking about, there are some concerns with that. In part, as it stands today, some of the concerns are that it's too burdensome, it's too cumbersome. I think, in fact, that unfortunately, I agree the fact that if we can have fiber across the entire state of Texas, that's what we need. However, the reality, we have to use all modes of broadband internet capability if we are truly going to connect people. So my biggest concern, in part, is the feds are putting such a constraint in that area that I think, unfortunately, a lot of smaller providers will be left out. And that also means a lot of rural Texas and rural America will be left out. So we're going to continue to engage in that process. I hope you will continue to engage in that process. You know, it was even asked to me as, well, if there's so many strings attached, do we even take the money? And I said, in fact, we have to utilize every single dollar that's available, regardless of the strings attached. But we got to make sure that we also educate everybody, as in what are those hurdles, what are those obstacles, and making sure at least policymakers understand that if you have a big bucket of dollars, those dollars may not be as most effective as they could be if the strings were not loosened up. So that's an issue that we're working on. As you all know, as I mentioned earlier, we went on our 12-city tour. I tell you, when it was over, I wanted to look at my staff and go, who the hell decided on 12 cities? But I knew they were going to say, you are the one that authorized that, Glenn. We wanted to hit, we would love to go to more cities, more communities, but the fact is we wanted to go to each one of the 12 economic regions and trying to make this as condensed as possible to be able to get out, cover the state of Texas, but do it in a manner so we can do our other jobs. Thank you for 16,000 Texans that have participated in our survey, and we appreciate, because we're going to take that information and utilize it. You know, we know this is an enormous challenge. It's an insurmountable challenge. I mean, it is one that is overwhelming. But as I tell my team all the time, you take a problem, and if you solve the first problem, and you solve a second problem, and you solve a third problem, then eventually you solve enough problems, you can be able to solve this insurmountable task that we have. So while we are excited about it, we do know the challenges are steep. We all know lack of access to broadband is nothing new. The Federal Reserve of Dallas reported in 2016 that this problem disproportionately impacts who? Rural communities, communities of color, those of economic less opportunities. And so we are working to try to, as you all are, to solve these very real problems. We know that the problem for Texas in every part of the state, but rural citizens, more than anybody else, 89% are without broadband access. And we know that the USDA found in 2019 that 25% of all farms, ranches, have no connectivity. You know, we've heard from a lot of people. My staff always gives me these notes, which in part I carry them around because I don't want them to think that, you know, we put all this work into it and you don't even pack it up there with you. So at least pack it up here, but I look at them, but I kind of go off script a whole lot. But part of the ones I wanted to at least focus on script were some of the comments that we got back from people as we were on that tour. And I wanted to make sure that I stated those words very precisely. We heard from Jim Barrett from Timpson, who told us that recently in a 30-day period, on 3 Fridays, they had no connectivity. Whether that was at the library that he worked, whether that's at the post office, whether that was at the drugstore, and that most of the banks in town were impacted as well. We all know how citizens in my old district of Senate District in Cuero, for example, how parents had to go to the local McDonald's or other restaurants or hot spots in buses that were parked around the district just so kids had connectivity. In fact, as the parent of 3 young teenagers, and yeah, I said teenagers, so if nothing else, pray for me. Wow, I tell people sometimes when I held my first daughter, Claire, who's 17, and I looked at her and I was like, she's such an angel. And then them angels became teenagers. I still think they're an angel, not as often though. But anyway, back to broadband. So, we all know that roughly 17% of Texas students lack access to high-speed internet, and 30% don't even have dedicated devices at home. One of the stories that I read about, which was pretty amazing, that one pastor in the small town of Laneville, he telephoned each one of his church members every Sunday morning, because whether citizens can't get out and go to church, they may want to have from home, sit on the couch and watch church, but those that don't have connectivity, they don't even have that option. And so, in fact, he called every single one. The fact is, what we learned on that tour is you name a problem, and it's made worse by not having connectivity. You name an opportunity, and it's further out of reach if what? You don't have connectivity. Rural hospitals are disappearing, so without that access, Texans don't have telemedicine. 4.5 million citizens took advantage of telemedicine during the pandemic, and 94% have said they are going to continue. And that's important whether you're in rural or in suburban areas. The fact is, I laughed at one of the comments from one of the ladies who, on our tour, she had recently moved from Plano, Texas, to Van Zant County. And she told us pretty correctly that, you shouldn't have to endure a significant difference if you move from one part of the state to another part of the state. Regardless of where you live, you should still have that connectivity and that access. For example, the school district chief technology officer in Ector County recently made the comment that 40% of the residents don't have access to reliable, high-speed, quality broadband internet. Said that local providers don't install the infrastructure where, in fact, there's not a profit, and we can't blame them. And most residents in the rural areas where are low income, and they are without the means to purchase that access. And they're not alone. Texans in every corner of the state don't have that connectivity. So we've also learned of local efforts, whether that's a pilot program in Waco, Texas, to provide free broadband internet to East Waco, whether that's the city of Brownsville that has its own broadband project. All of these projects are important as we try to divide and make sure that we have that gap closed. What are some of the common concerns? We all know them in the room. Across Texas, we have heard common concerns are slow data speed, unreliable access, cost, and what? Coordination. One person from Ivanhoe put it just right. I turn on the spigot and I've got water. I plug something in and I've got electricity. That's the way it should be with the internet and broadband. In another area, another person similarly said that even though internet is a necessity in some cases, it's talked about as a luxury, as if something like cable television instead of something as necessary as electricity or water, and we couldn't agree more. Let me tell you real quick on the state revenues. Wow, the last 13 months have been fantastic. Sales tax, just to put in perspective of the state budget, 1/3 is federal money, 2/3 is state money. Of the state money piece, tax collections is the biggest piece. Sales tax is 60% of all the taxes that we collect. And in fact, Texas last month had had a little over $3.8 billion. And put it in perspective, prior to the pandemic over 2 years ago, we'd had just a handful of months where we had $3 billion in a single month collection. And then April of last year, we finally hit a 3 again with $3.4 billion. The next month we were over 3, over 3, over 3. And then we got to December, which actually is December economic activities, which is January collections. And I don't know what you did, but I wish y'all would have Christmas every month. You and businesses in Texas had one fantastic Christmas. And in January was my Christmas as the treasurer because we had almost $3.9 billion in collections that month. So when I gave the legislature an updated revised estimate last legislative fall, I told them we would have probably estimated $12 billion in the state treasury when we close out this 2-year budget cycle, and we would have $12 billion in the state savings account. In fact, we are working on a revised estimate now. We will update the legislature and you as the public this summer, and in fact, that number will be bigger, in part because you had a great Christmas, and in part, we have continued to have very strong revenues into the collections. We've also had higher months than ever before of severance tax collections, unfortunately, because of higher prices, which not just impacts the Treasury on a positive note, but impacts all of us. So as we look forward, I just want to make the point that while the Treasury is strong today, and the Texas Treasury is stronger than actually has ever been, I also want to remind you there's a lot of clouds of uncertainty that are out on the horizon. I make the point frequently that Texas is 19% of all the exports of the entire United States. And why do I say that? I make the point we're very connected to the international economy. And so therefore, as we sit in this room and I get to look out and I get to shake hands and talk to each one of you, in fact, if we were in China, just to make a point, that in fact 25% or 40% of the entire country is not sitting in this room, they're back at home because they can't get out. And I make that point only to say, if there's something you've been trying to buy and you can't buy it, it's called a supply chain issue. Unfortunately, those things are continuing to exist and will exist for a while. And I make that point because that means businesses are struggling to try to figure out how to overcome those hurdles. As I make that comment, I think about last year, we had, unfortunately, Winter Storm Uri. So many people were impacted. A few years before that, we had Hurricane Harvey, where I call home back in Katy. Our backyard practically turned into a roaring river. We've had a pandemic. Reminds me of a year ago, I took my kids to a friend's house. Our good friend of ours, he works in emergency management for oil and gas company, has a natural gas generator. His wife always asked him, why do we have to have this generator? She learned why at Winter Storm Uri. So I took my kids and my young son, who was just a month shy of becoming 13. Jonah looked at me and said, Dad, why don't we have a generator? And I said, well, Jonah, I grew up on a family farm. We don't really need it. I mean, it's something that, I have to maintain. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. And my son looked at me, and right then I could see in his eyes, he was thinking about a global pandemic. He was thinking about Hurricane Harvey. He was thinking about Winter Storm Uri. He was thinking about all these things. And he literally looked at me 1 month shy of 13. He said, Dad, how many once-in-a-lifetime events am I going to have to live through? I make that point because the Treasury is healthy today, but we don't know what's on the horizon. So I have been in the legislative process when both its good years and its bad years, we have constitutional spending limits, and so therefore in the good years, it's a difficult process just as well. But last note, I'm out of time. I want to say thank you for each and every one of you being here today. Thank you for working on one of the most important issues this state is going to have. The fact is internet connectivity, as we all know, and I am preaching to the choir, that if we want to give Texans opportunities, people move to this state every day. They move here the same reason my family did in the 1840s. Why? For an economic opportunity. If we are going to give all Texans that economic opportunity that we all crave so bad, we have to connect the state of Texas. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for your work. And I just ask that you continue to be a partner with us because we want to partner with you because we know partnerships is how we're going to solve this insurmountable problem. So thank you for letting me be here. It's great to see you, and I hope y'all have the rest of a great day and look forward to working with y'all for years to come. God bless y'all.